Good afternoon. This is Vivian Young with 1000 Friends of Florida, and I'd like to welcome you to our monthly webinar. This month is Landscaping and Biodiversity, Conserving Biodiversity in Urban Planning and Development. I'd like to tell you a little bit about 1000 Friends of Florida. We're a statewide nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 1986, and we focus on saving special places, fighting sprawl, and building better communities. We have a host of educational and other programs that we conduct, and we encourage you to visit our website at 1000friendsofflorida.org to sign up for our email alerts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter to find out more about what we do and other activities. Just to give you a little bit of background, we do these webinars on a monthly basis. We have named them in honor of Dr. John M. DeGrove, who passed away last year. He was the grandfather of growth management in the United States. He was very instrumental in getting Florida's system set up, and he was one of our very beloved founders. So this is to honor his memory and keep his legacy going forward. We do offer them on a monthly basis. In addition to this webinar, on November 13th, we have a webinar on transportation mobility systems, and on December 11th on Florida Greenways and Trails system planning. We always apply for and have always received free certification credits for planners and attorneys, and you can sign up for them on our website, and we encourage you to do that. Just a little bit about logistics for today's webinar. First of all, you have a control panel on your screen, and there is a questions box. We encourage you to type any questions in the box, and if possible, refer to the slide number and our speaker when you post your questions. And as time permits, we will ask the questions of the presenter at the end. This webinar, we have received approval for it. It's been approved for 1.5 AICPCM and 2 CLE credits with a Florida bar. Also, for those of you who are interested, the PowerPoint is available for downloading. It's on our website at 1000friendsofflorida.org. On the right-hand side, there is a scrolling panel that says What's New, and it includes information on the PowerPoint and this biodiversity webinar. I'd like to turn it over to Charles Pattison at this point, who's going to talk a little bit about our presenter today. Charles?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Vivian. My name is Charles Pattison. I'm president of 1000 Friends of Florida. We're privileged today to welcome Dr. Mark Hostetler to our webinar. He's a professor at the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation at the University of Florida, where he received his Master's of Science and PhD in zoology. He has more than 20 years of experience in urban wildlife and green development issues, and does research and outreach on how urban landscapes can be designed and managed to conserve biodiversity. He's worked with various stakeholders to establish model community strategies that incorporate conservation design and management strategies to enhance biodiversity and minimize development impacts on nearby natural systems. Dr. Hostetler co-founded the University of Florida's Program for Resource-Efficient Communities, and he serves on the advisory board of Urbio, a scientific network for education and research that promotes biodiversity across the globe. He was a recipient of a Senior Scholar Fulbright Award and has various collaborations around the country and in the world. He conducts a national continuing education course on conserving biodiversity and subdivision development, and is the author, published last year, of a book, The Green Leap, Conserving Biodiversity and Subdivision Development, from the University of California Press. He has other publications, including That Gunk on Your Car, A Unique Guide to Insects in North America, for which he won a Nobel Award and got a spot on The Tonight Show. He has various TV and radio programs and has produced and directed an award-winning TV series titled Living Green, which currently is being shown on PBS and cable stations. He regularly contributes to several online blogs regarding urban biodiversity, conservation, and green development, including The Nature of Cities and the Huffington Post. We welcome Dr. Hostetler, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Charles and Vivian. I forgot about that introduction, that little slide that got in there about that gunk on your car. It was something I did years ago. But anyway, it was one of my 10 minutes on the Tonight Show, kind of an interesting little foray into, well, anyway. So, well, welcome everybody. And what I'd like to speak about in the next 50 minutes is kind of a overview about how we can do green development, particularly development in and around areas, cities, et cetera, that could potentially impact nearby natural areas. So first, what do we mean by biodiversity conservation, and just define that and get some examples out there so we're all on the same page. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about urban communities and the decision makers that we need to reach when we talk about doing green developments. And then I'll kind of go into, I'm not going to talk about the big picture in terms of where to site development, but say once development is sited, how do we address design, construction, and post-construction issues in terms of creating these green communities and with interest in conserving biodiversity. And in particular, I'll focus in on something that's rarely discussed when we talk about conservation developments or green developments. That's about post-construction issues. What do we do when people move in? And then I'll just end it up with a continuing education course, because a lot of the details will be left out because we only have 50 minutes to do this presentation. But I hope you'll come away with sort of the take-home message of how we need to address all of these decisions in terms of design, construction, and post-construction. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm a wildlife professor by training. I happen to focus on urban landscapes, and I work with a group at University of Florida called Program for Resource Efficient Communities. And the idea is there's a group of scientists interested in sustainability, however you define it. But the idea, when we do green developments, there are many different types of disciplines that are involved. There's energy, soil and water, there's wildlife, there's building and construction, there's environmental horticulture. And so there's a group of us that serve as a portal into the university. So when municipalities or developers or landowners want to do something a little more alternative, when they approach the University of Florida, how do they access this information? It can be confusing for people outside the university, all the different disciplines and departments. Even for us sometimes within the university, get confused who's doing what. And so the idea is if you do have questions or you do want to collaborate with and use the most current research to do a green development, one way to access the information is through this PREC program. So what is biodiversity? I know you probably have heard this buzzword. It's defined three different ways. Most people probably have heard of species diversity, and that's simply the number of different species that you find within a given area. But also biodiversity is in terms of habitat diversity, in terms of, you can think of like hammocks in Florida, prairie, wetlands, etc. So the number of different habitats is also a definition of biodiversity. And also genetic diversity. So, for example, our Florida panther is a subspecies of our mountain lion, and they can interbreed. In fact, we've used the mountain lion to interbreed with the Florida panther to remove some inbreeding depression. But the idea is we preserve that genetic diversity that's across all these different cats, and you can extend that to plants, other animals, etc. So, for example, a plant, the same native plant that can be found in the Panhandle and in South Florida may look the same, but they have a different genetic makeup due to their history, etc. So the idea is to preserve that genetic diversity, that species diversity, and that habitat diversity. But when we talk about biodiversity, we're really focusing on native and endemic species. Native species are those plants and animals that were here in Florida before roughly colonization of Europeans. And endemic species are those species that are found nowhere else in the world. So for example, you can think in terms of the Florida scrub jay or the Florida panther. And this is as opposed to species richness. So a lot of people say, well, if you look at urban areas, there's a lot of species diversity there, or species richness, I should say. But a lot of those are exotic species, and so we can have tens of thousands of cultivars and different species that are found and imported from around the world into the urban cities. But when we talk about conservation, we're not talking about conserving exotic species, more in terms of native and endemic species. Because if we just, for example, urban cities, if we look at the different types of exotic species that are found throughout the world, if we're talking about conserving them, we're really homogenizing all the diversity we found globally. And so we're really particularly focused on in terms of endemic and native species that are found in each area. So for example, in Florida, it's a hot spot. You know, we have over 2,800 different types of native plants, approximately 15,000 native invertebrates, and of these unique species, we have endemics. We have 14 endemic vertebrates found only in Florida, over 1,500 endemic invertebrates, and around 200 endemic plants. So we really have a unique natural heritage in Florida, and the whole idea between when we talk about conservation of native endemics is to preserve that natural heritage. And cities is a big part of this in terms of how we manage and design our cities, because they impact the ability of these endemic species to survive over the long term. But a lot of people say, well, why not we just focus outside of urban areas, only focus on the natural areas? I think there's several reasons. I don't have time to delve into them all, but there's many social and economic benefits. For example, if you conserve natural areas within and urban remnants within cities, homes that are located near these areas are found at higher prices, sell more per square foot. In many cases, urban landscapes is where people actually experience their natural heritage, where they learn about plants and animals or view wildlife in that way. So what do we want people to be exposed to? The exotics that can be found worldwide, or the ones that can be found in Florida and makes us unique and distinct from any other region? And I think the third principle is that really any more urban areas are more and more the primary problem because it impacts surrounding natural ecosystems, and that whatever happens within urban areas in terms of energy consumption, water consumption, landscaping choices, all those impacts don't stay within cities. They actually impact not only nearby surrounding landscapes, but regions and even global issues such as climate change. So if you have not seen the 2060 report, this is kind of a land use map in 50 years. And if you see the green areas in the slides, in the upper slide, you can see the red areas that currently are urban. But we are projected to double in our population size to 18 million, from 18 million to 36 million people. And with that, with the way what's currently on the books in terms of what's zoned, you can see the projected where urban will spread, and in many cases a lot of these green areas just become completely surrounded by urban areas. And so whether these green areas or the natural areas that are currently conserved, whether it's state or local or a national park, they're going to be heavily impacted by urban areas that are nearby. And even you can extend that. I mean, this is a satellite image. You know, if you really estimate the amount of municipalities that, if you looked at the land area of cities within North America, it's only about 10 to 12%. But their impacts are quite huge. And this is just an image of light pollution that occurs throughout Florida. And if you know about sea turtles and nesting problems along the coast of Florida, that light pollution can dramatically impact the ability for sea turtles to nest successfully, in terms that they're lured to the light, those baby sea turtles, or adult sea turtles will not nest on heavily lit beaches. Now, just as an aside here, I can't see a raise of hands, but I'm sure some of you have visited Canada. And if you look up in the Boreal Forest, Saskatchewan, up in the northwest corner there, there's not many people up there. That's Edmonton, if you see that bright blob up there in the northwest. If you've been up there, there's not many people, so where's all that light coming from? Well, essentially, those are gas flares from oil exploration in the wilderness. So all the consumption that we are experiencing within cities in, as you can see, the heavy lit areas in the eastern part of the United States along our coasts is driving oil exploration in Canada. And so even in the wilderness, in the Boreal Forest, we're having impacts from the cities that are found in the regions that you see within the U.S. So if cities are impacting many of our natural resources, I'm going to concentrate on biodiversity, but you can plug in energy, water, livability, etc., health. Who are the decision makers? If we're going to change going from conventional types of development and urban city management and growth to more something that's sustainable, who do we need to reach? I'm going to go through a cartoon here, this illustration when I was working at Arizona State University. Here you have, I guess, androgynous Pat here on the left who's decided to do turf grass in the middle of the desert. And you can imagine the amount of resources it takes to maintain that turf grass, not only in terms of water, but in terms of fertilizer, herbicides, and pesticides. And then we have the greenie on the right who's decided to do more natural landscaping with sorrels and native plants and no turf grass. And you can imagine those decisions, this group of decision makers, the citizens or homeowners, they can make this within minutes, days, weeks, etc., and change their landscaping. And cumulatively, if all the people within the community decide to do more natural landscaping, you can imagine the impact in terms of biodiversity. Now you've removed the monoculture of exotics, which is turf grass, and planted structurally diverse and species diverse native landscaping, and that can dramatically have impacts in terms of providing more wildlife habitat for critters within that city. Now that's one level of decision makers, but they are constrained by what the developer has done and associated environmental consultants. So you can imagine the developer set up perhaps covenants for the homes, and those covenants could dictate whether there's going to be turf grass or opportunity to use natives within the front yards and backyards within and around the neighborhood. With one stroke of the pen, the developer has decided, how big the homes are, how big the lots are, whether to cluster the homes, whether to use open space, whether to use native landscaping palette or to use a more exotic landscaping palette. And once those are set in place, it's very difficult for a homeowner to change what's the norm of the community. If you move into a community with 100% turf in all the front yards and they all look the same when you go down the street, it would probably, not only the covenants would say you couldn't do it, but it would be, you would get a little bit of a backlash if you ripped up that turf and put in some native landscaping, like a prairie, for example, within that community. So the developers are really constraining and putting into place what citizens and homeowners have to work with. But even developers, they don't have a free rein. They are somewhat constrained by what happens at the policy level. And here, this illustration, I know probably most of you are familiar with Florida Comprehensive Development Plans, but here's a discussion where the city staff or county staff is put up a land use map and talking about agricultural land use areas versus more commercial areas and residential areas, and with some input from the public, this land use map and all the LDRs, which are land development regulations that are associated with this map, are placed on paper, voted on by elected officials, and put into place to help manage growth. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole discussion whether this actually works in Florida. That's a whole nother topic that would take some time to discuss. But that's a system in place, and if the developers and environmental consultants are following these LDRs in the land use map, then they can't just do whatever they want. They're constrained by what's within and dictated by this comprehensive development plan. So with that, you have city planners, county planners, developers, and homeowners. And think of those three levels of decision makers. And being a wildlife biologist, I have to throw in this illustration that there are connections between how we make decisions as homeowners, developers, and city planners, and the impact on the distribution of species. So here's a red-tailed hawk, and if you look at a red-tailed hawk and just intuitively within your mind's eye, they operate at a much broader scale than a Carolina wren that's depicted at the bottom illustration. So they're looking at whole neighborhoods. The red-tailed hawk is looking at neighborhoods, open space, whole sides of a city, and so city planners, their decisions, where development goes and what development looks like, and how developers implement those plans also primarily impact the distribution of the red-tailed hawk. But for the Carolina wren, it operates at a much smaller scale, and so now developer decisions and homeowner decisions can impact the distribution of the Carolina wren. Now there's a lot of caveats with it, but that you get the idea that different species are impacted by different decisions within a city when it's done by policymakers versus homeowners. So a homeowner, for example, for a Carolina wren or ruby-throated hummingbird could make decisions within their backyard that could attract and provide habitat for these species. But for a red-tailed hawk, it would have not only be what the homeowner did, but also what the developer has done and the city planner has done. So there is these connections. So if you can imagine this hierarchical structure of decision making, you have policymakers constraining what developers can or cannot do, developers to constraining what citizens and homeowners can or cannot do. But there are feedback loops through voting. Citizens and homeowners can elect the officials that make the policies, and whether they're green policies or not green policies. And through the purchasing power, they can purchase homes that are green or not so green, and that would influence what developers do. And if you've been in Florida long enough, there's lots of influence from developers in the developing community in terms of how policymakers make their decisions. So if a goal is to conserve urban biodiversity and to minimize impacts on surrounding land, especially as we go from today to 2060, then we have to really focus on incorporating more green infrastructure into the design and more green practices into management plans of cities. So really, there are two goals, and there's many buzzwords out there. I'm just going to use conservation development as an idea that looks at conserving natural resources. But you want to conserve natural resources on site, so look for the best fits, conserve them in terms of any natural remnants and looking at water and energy issues, but also to minimize impact on surrounding areas. I think that's what often is left out of the equation, is that we think in terms of what's on the site, but then we got to think about surrounding land use as well, and impacts stemming from these urban areas can be quite dramatic. So let's think about the three phases of a conservation development. First, you have the site design. So it is important to set the framework for a community. So placing the roads and the homes and conserving natural areas when there's opportunity to conserve natural areas is critical. Without the framework, I mean, it would be difficult if you paved over the whole site to conserve natural resources in terms of water, energy, and biodiversity. So you got to have the site design installed properly. But then that's where we spend. I've gone around the world, nationally, internationally, even within Florida, and looked at green developments. In fact, I'll talk more about my book called The Green Leap. And I think we spend 90 to 95% of our efforts on looking at design, through policy, through developer type of decisions, through homeowner decisions. We look at design. But then we forget about, if we got a good design, now it's up to the contractors and subcontractors to implement the design. And during the construction phase, you can have many impacts that can create problems in the near and far future. And I'll discuss more about these. But let's say you have the site design and construction practice implemented well. Then you have post-construction phase, and this is where people move in. And if, particularly Florida, that has unique sets of ecosystems from the Panhandle to South Florida, and you have people from all around the world and from the north moving into Florida, how do you get them engaged and understand about the conservation initiative that was implemented during the design and construction phase? Because lots of things can go wrong when people move into a community. So let me just throw out a few site design issues. You can imagine that if you have a large percentage of impervious surfaces, you have a very fragmented design. A lot of times we talk about biodiversity if, let's say, for example, you are regulated to conserve 30% of the land area as remnants. Well, you could do that 30% in small little 1-acre blocks, or you can do one big 30-acre block. And a lot of times this fragmentation has lots of issues in terms of edge effects. I don't have time to go into that, but in terms of affecting wildlife and wildlife movement. So placing roads can impede and crossover corridors. You can have improper inventory of natural areas, so that of that 30% that's supposed to be conserved is not the best 30%. I mean, one of the key principles of conservation is to keep what's there. It's very, very difficult and costly to restore something to a natural habitat. But what about construction issues? Let's say you have a good design. There's lots of things that happen during construction. I mean, the construction with all the earthwork machine movement is heavily impacting the area, perfect for invasive exotics to invade. So you need to have due diligence, checking the earthwork machines as they come onto the construction area, making sure they operate in a way that doesn't impact maybe some of those majestic trees that are saved, or buffer zones that are put into place to treat stormwater. If you park these machines, these heavy machines, or run these machines under the root zones of trees or buffer areas, you lose the percolation value of the soil itself. And so what was thought to be a buffer for a wetland that's nearby, now with all the earthwork machines being parked within that buffer, now the soil is so compacted that it doesn't filter out the water running off the nearby hardscapes. There's many, I could go into many examples. You can come up with them, and I've seen it. I mean, how many of you have been on a construction site and seen those silt fences being properly maintained throughout the whole construction period? I mean, it's just takes a lot of engagement and education to get the contractors and subcontractors to understand why those silt fences need to be maintained and properly maintained over the time. So, here's an example. It's hot in Florida, and so where would people park their machines? If there's a buffer area, this buffer area was conserved to provide some protection for a nearby wetland, but now all the contractors are parking their machines within that buffer area, and now not only does it destroy the understory and the vegetation, which is also wildlife habitat, but now the soil becomes almost like concrete and loses its percolation ability. What about post-construction issues? People move in. You can have people plant invasive exotics. They can have a feral cat colony. They have improper pet management. I'm sure most of you have heard about the Burmese python problem in the Everglades. That all came primarily from releasing pets from people who didn't want to take care of the Burmese once it got big. You can have improper pesticide use. You can have improper management of septic tanks. You can have people fertilizing too much. The list goes on and on and on. I think of the 3 phases, this is probably one of the most critical phases that needs to be addressed, but it's not currently addressed in most policy or development projects. And I had to throw this up. Feeding alligators, I'm still astounded. I'm originally from Indiana, coming to Florida years ago, and seeing this whole phenomenon of people feeding marshmallows to alligators. I mean, these large reptiles are not something to be trifled with. And so let's just say feeding alligators is just going to create problems. Alligators that lose their fear of humans become an issue